in the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to the trees like stubborn ghosts and the sun rises with cautious hesitation, there lies a place the maps barely dared to name, Pine Hollow. By 1834, it was more myth than town, a stitched-together patch of cabins and whispers, populated by fewer than 200 souls, all bound to each other by blood, marriage, and Baptist law. Into this secluded world stepped a weary traveler, Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, and his 2 daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, twin girls of just 9 winters. The path to Pine Hollow had been no small trial. Late autumn rains had turned mountain trails into slick ribbons of mud, and Ezekiel, his boots worn and his bones aching, had carried Rachel for 5 miles through the slush when her fever made walking impossible. When they finally arrived at sunset on November 15th, Pastor William Phillips was just finishing evening prayers in the modest wooden church built by hand from the surrounding trees. Phillips, a meticulous man who had given up city comforts for frontier faith, was struck immediately by the look in the eyes of the Morrison girls. Not the feverish haze of illness or the weariness of travel, but something stranger, a kind of knowing. They were small and pale, yes, but their gazes met his with such clarity. He would later write that it felt like being studied by ancient souls trapped in the bodies of children. Rebecca, the more outgoing of the 2, smiled at him with calm confidence. Rachel lingered behind her, silent and watchful, as if the cabin air had secrets only she could taste. That evening, the Morrisons joined the Phillips family for a simple meal of stew and cornbread. As the lantern cast long shadows on the walls, Rebecca turned to Mrs. Phillips and asked, "Did your roses ever recover from the blight? The ones along the eastern fence?" The pastor's wife dropped her spoon. That rose blight had struck 3 summers ago, a strange, sudden disease that had nearly destroyed her beloved flower bed. But it had never been discussed outside the local congregation. Rebecca only shrugged when asked how she knew. "I dreamed of roses on a road, and somehow I knew they belonged to you." That moment was recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal that very night, the same journal later found when the old church was torn down more than a century later. He would write that it was the first strange thing that happened, but not the last. Not even close. The next morning arrived, draped in gray clouds, with wind sharp enough to rattle the window panes. Pastor Phillips rose before dawn, as always, to prepare his sermon. But when he stepped outside, he found Ezekiel already awake, seated near the fire pit with his Bible open but unread, his eyes lost in distant thought. "They had dreams again," Ezekiel said quietly, sensing the pastor's approach. "They always do before we reach a place." But these were darker than usual. Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca emerged from the cabin, hair tousled, face pale but focused. She walked straight up to him and said, "In your church, under the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something that shouldn't be there. Rachel saw it, and I dreamed why you put it there." Phillips froze. Beneath that very board lay a secret he had never shared with a living soul. A bottle of whiskey, hidden months ago in a moment of weakness. He had justified it to himself. At the time, better to keep temptation close and resist it than to pretend it wasn't there at all. Wrapped around that bottle was a piece of cloth that had once been a baby blanket. Rachel now appeared beside her sister and said softly, "It's blue, that blanket. From the baby you lost." The pastor's knees buckled slightly. The child's words had pierced his heart. That blanket belonged to his only son, who had died as an infant 5 years earlier. He had kept it to remind himself of both failure and faith. But he had told no one, not even his wife. Ezekiel offered no comfort, only understanding. "It began when they were still toddlers," he explained. "At first, I thought it was only coincidence, but over time, Their knowledge became too specific, too accurate. Dreams that matched people, places, and tragedies we hadn't yet seen. The girls' strange abilities had followed them from town to town. Ezekiel was known among remote congregations, not just for his powerful sermons, but for leaving behind healed divisions, reconciled families, even full revivals. People whispered that his preaching had power, but those who paid attention knew it was often the girls who quietly spoke to someone behind closed doors. Afterward, old wounds would mend, secrets would be uncovered. Sins repented at first. The congregation of Pine Hollow received them with the same wary hospitality they gave any visiting preacher. But the air began to shift with small things. Children growing quiet around the twins. Adults finding themselves unwilling to meet the girls' eyes. And then came the Sunday service. Ezekiel delivered his sermon with passion, a fiery call for repentance and truth, not unusual for a traveling preacher. But what came next stunned every soul in the church as the congregation filed out. Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a well-respected farmer known for his generous tithes. "Mr. Turner," she said cheerfully, taking a little from the collection, "plate isn't stealing if you plan to give it back someday, right?" Turner turned white as ash. 6 months earlier, he had started skimming small amounts to cover debts from a failed investment in Louisville, always promising himself he'd return it once he recovered. He had told no one before he could respond. Rachel stepped forward and faced Martha Whitfield, an elderly widow held in high moral regard. "Your husband didn't die in a farming accident," Rachel said softly. "He ran away. That's why you hide the letters." Martha gasped and nearly collapsed. Her husband had abandoned her 15 years earlier, vanishing with their savings. She'd told everyone he had died to preserve her dignity and raise her children without shame. The few letters he sent from Missouri had remained hidden beneath the floorboards of her room. The twins moved through the congregation like tiny instruments of divine reckoning. To the local doctor, they spoke of patients who had died due to treatments he was never trained to give. To the Millers, they mentioned the son hidden away in the attic, born wrong. They whispered, the shame of it too great for public life. To a young boy, they described his secret affair with a married woman. Meetings held at twilight, names spoken aloud, but none of these left a mark like Rebecca's final words that day. She stepped before the altar, laid her small hand on the cross carved by the town's founders, and said, "This is sacred ground, but it was already cursed before the church was built." The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire. They died right here, and some of you already know why. The sanctuary froze. Even the wind outside the church stopped. Not a soul breathed. The Whitmans, a respected family of settlers who had perished in a fire back in 1818, were long buried, long mourned. But the certainty in the child's voice cracked something wide open. Elderly heads turned. Old secrets stirred, and in the silence that followed, Pine Hollow began to tremble under the weight of its forgotten sins. When Rebecca Morrison uttered the name Whitman, it was like striking flint against dry timber. A name buried beneath 16 years of silence burst into flame. No one dared speak, but the air inside the church felt heavier than stone. "Pastor." Phillips clutched the pulpit as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. The congregation had long accepted the Whitman tragedy as a house fire. A tragedy, yes, but a clean one. An act of nature, cruel but indifferent. But what the Morrison girl had said twisted that version of history into something rotten. Rebecca hadn't spoken in riddles. She'd named the family. Said they'd died here, in the church. Sighed. People in the room knew why. Elder Jeremiah Thompson, white-bearded and nearly stooped in half by time, rose slowly from his pew. He had been one of the first settlers in Pine Hollow, and at 73, he bore the weight of memories no one else dared carry. You speak of things that happened before you were born, he said, his voice cracking with disbelief and dread. How could you possibly know what you claim? Rebecca turned to face him, her bright blue eyes darkened with something deeper than sadness, something like truth made flesh. Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder, she said calmly. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll her father made, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair braided inside. Whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. They didn't die in a house fire, Rachel added. They came here to hide. Someone was chasing them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway. The silence that followed was suffocating. Pastor Phillips felt the world narrowing around him. He had heard whispers, half-sentences, exchanged behind closed doors, old eyes avoiding contact whenever the name Whitman surfaced. Now those whispers echoed like thunder inside his skull. Samuel Turner, still reeling from Rebecca's earlier accusation, leapt to his feet in an protest. This is madness, he shouted. These are just children, making up ghost stories to frighten decent folk. But then another voice, quiet, shaking, emerged from the pews. There were bloodstains, Mrs. Carter whispered. Elizabeth's. Mother-in-law, a widow herself. She had scrubbed the church floor for years. I tried everything, soap, ash, vinegar. The stain came back, always. Benjamin Foster, the oldest living carpenter in Pine Hollow, nodded gravely. And the sounds. At night, he said, like crying. No one lived near the church, but the sounds came anyway. I told myself it was the wind. Dr. Hayes, the town's only doctor, stepped forward. 3 years ago, he said slowly, we reinforced the eastern foundation wall. I remember noticing something strange in the mortar, pieces that looked ... like bone. The crowd recoiled. And then Ezekiel spoke, his voice deep and low like a bell tolling. I've seen this before, he said. In towns just like this. Secrets buried so deep, they rot the roots of everything built above them. My daughters, they don't choose what they know. The knowledge finds them. Pastor Phillips stared at the girls. What kind of God would burden children with this? And yet, he could not deny it. Their words matched things no outsider could ever know. He turned to Ezekiel. How long has this been happening? Ezekiel sighed, weathered hands resting on the back of a pew. Since. They began to speak. At first, it was small things, describing dreams about people they hadn't met. But the dreams grew clearer, sharper. Over time, we realized they weren't imagining. They were remembering things that had never been told. And do they understand what they're saying? Phillips asked. Ezekiel looked at his daughters. Not fully, but they carried the weight. Just the same. The next night, Pastor Phillips could not sleep. His usual prayers felt hollow. He paced the floor of his cabin, mind spinning through the web the Morrison girls had torn open. Eventually, he lit a lantern and descended into the cramped storage space beneath the chapel. He had combed these records before, but not like this. Not with suspicion in his heart. And there, buried beneath decades of papers, he found something he'd never seen, a slim leather-bound notebook, water-stained and brittle with age. The handwriting was familiar. It belonged to his predecessor, Pastor Marai Hayes. By candlelight, Phillips read through the pages. The entries began with the usual, births, deaths, weather reports. But then the tone shifted. Hayes had been tormented. In the winter of 1818, Jacob Whitman, it seemed, had uncovered something terrible. There had been a meeting, a confrontation with the town's founding elders over money, corruption, and rumors of travelers vanishing along the mountain pass. Whitman had demanded confession and restitution. The entry dated December 22nd was short but harrowing. The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family sought sanctuary here, but they were followed. I heard the children cry. Then silence. Elder Thompson and the others insisted the truth would destroy the town. I agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips's hands trembled. The journal confirmed it. The Whitman family hadn't died in there. Home. They had been killed in the church. The fire had been a lie. Before he could gather his thoughts, there came a knock. Rebecca stood in the doorway, the moonlight painting her features ghostly pale. Her hair was braided neatly, though no one had seen her prepare for sleep. "You found it," she said. "Found what?" he asked, though his heart already knew. "Pastor Hayes's journal," she said matter-of-factly. "Faith showed me in a dream." She said he tried to do the right thing, but fear got in the way. How did you know where to find it?" Phillips whispered. "There was a draft from the stone near the foundation. That's where he hid it." He had indeed found it behind a loose stone near the base of the old foundation, just as she'd said. Rebecca looked past him, her gaze drifting toward the churchyard beyond. She also said something else. Phillips waited. She said the ground was cursed long before her blood touched it. Jacob Whitman found out where the money came from travelers. Some were robbed, others never made it out of the valley. Phillips closed his eyes. He remembered stories, vague reports of missing men, blamed on bears, rivers, mountain storms. Had they all been lies? "The church," Rebecca said softly, "was built with blood. Money. That's why faith and hope can't rest." He slumped into his chair, the weight of generations crashing down upon him. "Why you?" he asked. Rebecca's face grew solemn. "Because we listen when others don't, and because the dead don't stop speaking just because no one wants to hear." Sunday morning arrived cloaked in bitter wind and a kind of thick, low-hanging clouds that felt too heavy for the sky. Pine Hollow, nestled among the ancient ridges, awoke slower than usual, not from laziness, but from the invisible pressure of truth hovering like a storm. The Morrisons' presence had unsettled something long buried, and the town could feel it. The congregation gathered once again in the modest wooden church. Pastor Phillips, his heart still rattling from the revelations of the previous night, stood behind the pulpit with the weight of Hayes's hidden journal pressed tightly beneath his robe. He hadn't told anyone, not yet, that the Morrison girls had been right. Every word. Ezekiel Morrison opened the service with a sermon that struck a deeper chord than anyone expected. He didn't shout or thump the Bible like other preachers. Instead, he spoke gently, like a man comforting someone at their deathbed. He spoke of repentance, of the cost of silence, of sins festering in darkness. The words fell like hammers wrapped in velvet dot after the final hymn, as members began to rise, thinking the tension had passed. Rebecca stepped forward. "Mr. Turner," she said. Samuel Turner turned slowly, knowing, dreading what was coming. "The money you took from the collection," she said sweetly. "It's okay to take it back if you return it, right? Papa says God forgives honest people who try to make things right." A wave of stillness passed through the room. Turner's face drained of color, his lips trembling. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His theft had been secret, quiet, a few coins each week, taken under the weight of desperation. No one knew, except her Rachel, as always, peered silently beside her sister. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, turning to the widow in the second row, "your husband didn't die like you said. He ran away." A sharp gasp sliced the air. Martha Whitfield's hands gripped the pew as if it might keep her from falling. Her lie had lasted 15 years, a story crafted to protect her children from shame. Her husband had written her from Missouri, begging for forgiveness. She'd hidden his letters under a floorboard, praying no one would ever learn the truth. The girls moved methodically, like dowsing rods drawn to guilt. To Dr. Hayes, They mentioned patients who should have lived and didn't, because his training had been limited to books and guesswork, not to the Miller family. They described the attic space where they kept their disabled son, hidden from view so the neighbors wouldn't whisper to young Thomas Brett. They spoke softly of late-night meetings with Elizabeth Carter, a married woman whose husband often traveled for work. They delivered each secret with childlike innocence. No judgment, no shame, just truth, like pebbles dropped into a still pond, each ripple widening until the entire congregation sat paralyzed in silence. Pastor Phillips could feel the air change. It had become electric, thick with fear, awe, and something close to reverence. The girls were no longer curiosities. They were mirrors, polished to reflect the ugliest corners of every soul in Pine Hollow. And then Rebecca walked back to the altar. She placed her hand on the wooden cross, fingers tracing the carved grain like she was reading something only she could see. "This is holy ground," she said. "But it's been stained. Something terrible happened here. Before the hymns, before the sermons." She turned slowly. The Whitman family didn't burn in their home. They died here, in this very room. Gasps. One man stood as if to object, but sat down just as quickly. The blood drained from his face. "And some of you," Rebecca said, her voice steady and clear, "know exactly why." No one moved. Even the floorboards seemed to hold their breath. Elder Thompson, who had denied nothing the day before, closed his eyes. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the pew in front of him. Rachel spoke next, quieter but no less piercing. "Faith had a doll. Hope had a locket. One of them wore a blue dress. The other ... her nightgown. She was sick. That's why they didn't run. That's why they hid." A woman near the back began to weep. Not softly, loudly, openly. Her sobs cut through the silence like thunder in a canyon. Pastor Phillips stepped forward at last, unable to remain still. "Why?" he asked. "Why would anyone? How could a community do such a thing?" Rebecca looked at him with those knowing eyes. They didn't mean to kill them. They just wanted Jacob to stop talking. "About what?" he asked, voice hollow. Rachel answered, "About where the church money came from." Whispers buzzed around the room. Phillips remembered the entries in Hayes's journal. Jacob Whitman had confronted the town elders. He had discovered something dark, tied to the early days of Pine Hollow. Rebecca continued, her voice rising slightly. The horses needed shoes, but the men who owned them were already dead. Jacob knew. And suddenly, the implications hit like a landslide. The money hadn't come from donations. It had come from travelers, men who vanished along the mountain trails, whose disappearance had been blamed on wilderness, bandits, or weather. The elders had covered it up, used the stolen wealth to build Pine Hollow, its church, its homes, its very soul. Ezekiel remained still through all of this, his face drawn, his hands folded in front of him. He had seen towns like this before. He had watched his daughters peel away the layers of lies and leave only the raw, blood-stained truth beneath. That evening, after the congregation had scattered in dazed silence, Pastor Phillips sat alone in his cabin, the journal of Pastor Hayes open in his lap. He stared at the final page again and again, unable to read it without chills. They cried before the end, the children. I heard them behind the altar. We told ourselves it was necessary. Elder Thompson said we were protecting the town. But what we protected was built on sin. He felt sick. Rebecca knocked gently at the door, and Phillips opened it without a word. "You know now," she said softly. "You read it." He nodded. "I didn't want to believe," he said, "but I can't deny it anymore." "Faith told me to thank you," Rebecca said, "for listening. Is she with you all the time?" He asked. Rebecca shook her head. "They come and go. We don't control it." "And how do you know where to look?" he asked. "You couldn't have known about the journal ... not where it was." "Faith showed me," she said simply. She remembered where Pastor Hayes hid it, behind the loose stone. She wanted someone to find it. Pastor Phillips felt like the earth was shifting under his feet. His world, everything he had believed about ministry, about redemption, about justice, was unraveling, and the unraveling had only just begun. The winds that swept through Pine Hollow that night howled like wolves mourning something long dead. Though no one spoke openly, the town was already splintering. Children were kept indoors, elders walked with their eyes low, and neighbors passed each other like strangers. What the Morrison twins had revealed, or perhaps unleashed, had shifted the air itself. Pastor Phillips hadn't slept. He sat by the cold hearth in his cabin, Hayes's journal on the table beside him. Every line he read seemed heavier than the one before. Jacob Whitman's confrontation, the whispered accusations of theft, the promise to go to Lexington and expose the truth. It had all been written. And then, silence. A silence too thick to be natural. By morning, his decision was made. He would confront Elder Thompson. Directly. At first light, he made his way to the old man's homestead. Thompson was outside, seated in a rocking chair that barely moved, his hands gnarled like tree roots, resting on a cane. "You've read it," Thompson said without looking up. Phillips didn't bother with pleasantries. Every word. There was a long pause. Then the old man sighed, not like someone caught, but like someone finally freed. "Jacob was my brother-in-law," he said, voice hoarse. "When he discovered what we'd done, I begged him not to go public. I told him we'd find a way to make it right quietly, but he wouldn't have it. Said sin needed light, not shadows." Phillips stared at the man he'd respected for years. "So you followed him to the church?" Thompson's lips trembled. He thought the sanctuary would protect them, that no one would desecrate the house of God. He looked away. "But desperation, it makes beasts out of men." "We didn't plan to kill them, just scare him. But when Mary screamed, and the girls..." He stopped. Phillips felt his throat tighten. "You buried them in the church?" Thompson nodded slowly. "We wrapped the children in the altar cloth. We thought if we prayed hard enough, God might forgive us." He wiped at his face. "But the blood never washed away. Not really. Not from the floor, and not from us." And then, as if summoned by the very mention of the past, a rider approached from the eastern trail. Dust clung to the stranger's coat. He rode a fine horse and wore the sharp expression of someone used to asking questions and getting answers. He introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington. "I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb," Brennan said, shaking Phillips's hand. "He passed recently. Among his belongings, we found references to business dealings with Pine Hollow in its early years. I've come to trace the path of certain ... irregular funds." Phillips's blood chilled. The name Marcus Webb appeared in Hayes's journal, one of the men who vanished along the trail. Before he could respond, Rebecca stepped out of nowhere, barefoot in the dewy grass, as if the earth itself had brought her forward. He had a gold pocket watch, she said to Brennan, her voice clear and sure, with a cracked crystal. It broke when he fell from his horse. Brennan's demeanor shifted. "How do you know about that?" "It's buried behind the church," Rachel said, stepping beside her sister, "with the money bag and the horse's bridle. Elder Thompson hid them after the trail turned red." Thompson, who had been watching from his porch, didn't even argue. He simply lowered his head and whispered, "Dear God." The dam had cracked. "I demand we excavate immediately," Brennan declared. "If what they say is true, we're dealing with murder." Phillips gave a solemn nod. "Then let the earth speak." Within the hour, several townsmen gathered with Shovels, the site behind the church, a place where grass never seemed to grow right, became a scene of grim industry. Rebecca and Rachel stood silently, their faces unreadable. 3 feet down, a dull metallic clang stopped the digging. The first item revealed was a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystal was indeed cracked. The initials MW gleamed inside the lid. A rotted leather bag and remnants of a bridle followed. Brennan examined them with the detachment of a man who'd seen too much truth in too many courtrooms. It matches the description in Webb's letters precisely, he confirmed. But the real confirmation came from Elder Thompson. He stepped forward slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. There were others, he whispered. Marcus Webb wasn't the first. And he wasn't the last. Gasps echoed around the gathered crowd. Turner backed away. You told us it was one mistake. It began as necessity, Thompson said. Our children were starving. The winters were brutal. But then the trail, it became opportunity. He closed his eyes. Webb fought back. That's why it went wrong. But most didn't. The full horror unfolded like a rotten tapestry. Between 1808 and 1820, a string of travelers had disappeared, men with money, passing alone through Pine Hollow. Their deaths had gone uninvestigated, attributed to wild animals or misfortune. But the truth was far worse. They had been murdered. Their possessions had funded the founding of the town, its church, its homes, even its school. Phillips could barely breathe. And all this all of it happened in the name of survival? Thompson nodded. At first. But then it was about pride. About building something lasting. Rebecca stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, she said softly, the nightmares stopped after the first year, didn't they? You thought it meant God forgave you. His face twisted. How do you? And yet, Rachel added, you still see Webb's face. Every night, before you sleep. The old man collapsed onto a stump, his body trembling. I didn't want it to go this far, he whispered. But it had. Phillips stood amidst the broken earth, feeling as though the very land itself had been split open. The church he served, the sermons he preached, had all taken place above bones and secrets. Brennan turned to him. We'll need to notify the authorities. This is no longer a matter of local resolution. And Phillips, hollowed out by truth, could only nod. The dead had spoken, through dreams, through children, through the creak of floorboards and the weight of guilt. And Pine Hollow, built on prayer and stolen gold, was finally listening. The sun had barely broken the horizon when the first of the county officials arrived in Pine Hollow. Word of the shocking discoveries, the unearthed artifacts, the old man's confession, the children with impossible knowledge, had traveled faster than wind. Solicitor Brennan had wasted no time dispatching urgent letters. By morning, the once quiet settlement found itself swarmed by lawmen, each bearing the weight of justice sharpened by disbelief. A territorial judge, 2 federal, marshals, and the county sheriff dismounted outside the church, their boots sinking into soft ground dampened by an overnight frost. Judge Silas Harrison, with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, immediately commanded the kind of silence that made people stand straighter and talk less. He'd held court in mining towns and boom cities alike, but nothing had prepared him for a ghost town hiding inside its own skin. This is your courtroom now, he said to Sheriff Mackenzie, gesturing toward the weathered church. Let's peel this rot from the bone. Inside, Pastor Phillips had already cleared the sanctuary, removing pews to make space for testimony and justice. The very floor beneath them, he now knew, concealed truths no sermon could bury. His heart trembled, not just from fear, but from the raw pressure of responsibility. He had come here to serve a flock. Instead, he had stumbled upon a tomb. The townsfolk were summoned, all of them, from farmers to widows, shopkeepers to children. Every soul was called into the church. The same church that had hosted years of weddings, funerals, and Sunday prayers. Now it was a place of judgment. Elder Thompson sat at the front, flanked by Samuel Bradford and Marcus Perry, the other surviving elders from the town's founding council. Shackles had not yet been placed on their wrists, but their shoulders. Sagged as though already burdened with chains, the Morrison twins sat quietly beside their father near the front. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Judge Harrison began the hearing with the precision of a man who'd long since lost his patience for lies. "Rebecca Morrison," he said, "please step forward." Rebecca stood, her small frame dwarfed by the towering wooden cross behind her. She didn't fidget or flinch. Her blue eyes met the judge's without fear. "Tell us," he said, "how you knew about the location of Marcus Webb's belongings." "Faith Whitman showed me," she answered simply. "She said the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed Mr. Webb. She wanted the truth told." A ripple moved through the room, part astonishment, part dread. "And you, Rachel Morrison?" the judge asked. Rachel stood beside her sister. Her voice was quieter, but no less certain. "We see it," she said. "In dreams, like stories already told. We feel the fear. We hear their last words. Sometimes we feel their pain." The church seemed to bend inward at her words. "Even?" The wind outside paused. "Are you claiming to speak with the dead?" Judge Harrison asked, tone measured but firm. Ezekiel Morrison stood up now. "Your Honor," he said with calm authority, "my daughters never claimed to understand their gift, only to report what they experience. I've seen them reveal details in towns across this region, things they had no earthly way of knowing." Sheriff Mackenzie, a practical man more used to chasing livestock thieves than ghosts, leaned forward. "Can you tell us," he asked the girls directly, "how many people were murdered on that trail?" Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their eerie, silent glances. 11, Rebecca said. "Over 3 years," Rachel added, "all of them traveling alone." Rebecca continued, "Carrying money. One was a preacher like Papa. He had gold, coins sewn into his saddle." Mackenzie blinked. "Do you know his name?" Rachel nodded. "Samuel Collins. He was going to build a new church in Tennessee. His horse had a white star on its forehead." Mackenzie rifled through a worn leather journal. His jaw tightened. "September 1819, he confirmed. "That description matches a missing persons report from the Territory Archive." And then Elder Thompson rose slowly, trembling. "Your Honor," he said, "I can't carry this anymore." The room fell into breathless silence. What these girls say, it's true, all of it, but there's something even worse. Pastor Phillips felt the dread rise in his throat like floodwater. "Speak plainly," Judge Harrison ordered. Thompson's voice cracked. "Mary Whitman, she was pregnant, with twins." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd like thunder across mountains. "I didn't know," he wept. "Not at first, but when we wrapped the bodies, we saw," the doctor said. "They might have lived. If we hadn't." He couldn't finish. Rebecca stepped forward, her tone soft. "Reverend, that's why we see everything so clearly," she said. "Faith and Hope weren't the only children who died that night. Their unborn sisters died with them. 4 souls, all crying out." Dr. Hayes stood now, pale and shaken. "I buried them," he confessed. We found signs of pregnancy, but we told ourselves the babies were too young, that they didn't need burial rites." Ezekiel turned toward him, eyes filled with grief and certainty. "Every soul matters to God." Judge Harrison, face grim, looked toward the 3 elders. "Do you confess to the murder of the Whitman family, including 2 unborn children?" He asked Dot Thompson Bradford, and Perry nodded in pained silence. And the 11 travelers along the mountain trail? Thompson spoke for all 3. We planned it together. We carried it out together. We buried it together. And we've lived with the weight every day since. The courtroom was silent, but for the wind. Somewhere in the back, a child began to cry. Judge Harrison turned to the crowd. "I've presided over hangings, land disputes, and civil unrest," he said. "But never have I seen a case that so fully challenges the boundary between faith and law. The facts are clear. The dead do not lie. And it seems they also do not forget." He nodded to the sheriff. "Take them into custody. Formal charges will be filed." As the 3 elders were led away in silence, Pastor Phillips looked toward the twins, 2 fragile vessels carrying unbearable truths. They sat quietly, not triumphant, not smug, just ... weary. He stepped toward them. "Do you still hear them?" he asked. Rebecca nodded. "Sometimes they're quiet," she whispered. "But not tonight." Rachel's eyes shimmered with something not entirely childlike. "There's more." Pastor Phillips's heart sank. "More?" he echoed. Rebecca took a slow breath. "The mine shaft, east of town. It's not just a place where old crimes sleep." Rachel continued. "Some people ... never stopped. Not even after the Whitmans." "What are you saying?" Judge Harrison asked sharply. "We're saying," Rachel said softly, "that others picked up where the elders left off." The room shuddered again. Shock gave way to horror. Judge Harrison stood. "Then our investigation is far from over." The dead had risen, not in body, but in voice. And through the mouths of 2 9-year-old girls, they would not be silenced. A stillness in Pine Hollow didn't last long. The moment Rachel spoke those quiet words, others picked up where the elders left off. A chill crept through the bones of every man and woman in the church. The townsfolk were still, reeling from the confessions, the discoveries, the truth that their entire home had been built atop lies and blood. But now, it seemed the sins of the past weren't finished. They'd become a legacy. Judge Harrison stood slowly, his face hard as frost. "Sheriff McKenzie," he said, "we expand the investigation immediately." By nightfall, torches lined the eastern path toward the old mine shaft. Pastor Phillips led the way, alongside the sheriff and Brennan, whose determination had grown colder with each passing revelation. Rebecca and Rachel followed without protest, their bare feet barely rustling the dry leaves beneath them. The mine had long been abandoned, sealed decades earlier after a collapse killed 2 workers. So the story went. As they approached the yawning black mouth of the shaft, Rebecca stopped. "They're in there," she whispered. 3 more. Rachel pointed toward the edge of the collapsed tunnel. They were buried under a cave-in that wasn't an accident. Men with shovels and lanterns stepped forward, their faces pale. As the digging began, Rebecca turned her face away. She didn't like watching. She said the voices screamed when their bones were disturbed. An hour later, a glint of metal shone through the dirt. Then bone. Then fabric, shredded but unmistakably human-made. Among the remains were belongings that matched records of missing persons. A merchant named Daniel Cross, a millwright named Elias Boone, and a postman whose name no one had ever written down, only remembered by his red wool coat and wedding band. Judge Harrison knelt beside the recovered items, brushing dirt from the bones. 3 more names to add to the reckoning, he murmured. 3 more voices denied justice. But it wasn't over. Not yet. "We need to look beneath the church," Rachel said suddenly. The judge turned sharply. "Why?" Rebecca spoke now, her voice almost breaking. "Because some didn't make it far. Their blood mixed with the mortar. They're still inside." Sheriff McKenzie hesitated. "You're suggesting the church itself Holds remains? Rachel only nodded. Pastor Phillips, his face drained of color, whispered, I've been preaching over graves. Judge Harrison clenched his jaw, tear up the floor. The excavation of the church's foundation began at dawn. Pine Hollow's residents gathered silently, watching as every board, every nail, every beam soaked in years of prayer and song was pulled away. The ground underneath was packed tight, but it didn't take long to find what they were looking for. 3 full skeletons. Their bones were twisted with stone, sealed in place as though the building had been constructed directly atop them. Each one held clues: a rusted silver knife, a gold ring bearing the initials J.P., a copper cross chain curled beneath the ribcage of the third. Solicitor Brennan held the items reverently. Joshua Patterson, he identified. William Morse, Robert Chun. Names, finally spoken aloud. For years, their families had searched. For years, Pine Hollow had hosted services, picnics, weddings, while their bodies lay trapped beneath. The altar. Gasps gave way to sobs. The truth was no longer whispered. It was unearthed. Judge Harrison addressed the congregation that afternoon, standing beneath the cross that had once offered comfort, now tarnished by guilt. The evidence before us is conclusive. Pine Hollow's founding was not an act of faith, but of fraud. 11 travelers, 2 unborn children, the Whitman family, and now 3 more, all lost to violence and greed. The 3 surviving elders sat in shackles. Nearby, Hollow, ruined, they said nothing. The townspeople looked toward Pastor Phillips, whose face was marked with deep grief. I have led services above their bones, he said quietly. I have baptized children with water that ran beside cursed earth. This church must be reborn or torn down. Rebecca stepped forward, gently placing a hand on the altar's edge. They forgive you? She said. Who? Phillips asked, his voice cracking. Faith and hope, she replied. They understand. But the church must change. You can't pray over lies. Rachel added, consecration isn't just a word, it's action. Judge Harrison nodded. Then we'll rebuild. The right way. But Brennan was not finished. We still have a legal matter, he said. The money. The Webb estate. The families of the dead. They're owed compensation. Elder Thompson, though frail, spoke up. It's gone. Every cent. Used on buildings, schools, mills. We thought, if we built something good, it would cancel out the evil. Evil doesn't cancel, Brennan replied. It stains. Judge Harrison looked around the church, then at the town beyond. Then the town itself pays the debt. Every building built with stolen money will be sold. The land auctioned. Funds returned to the victim's kin. Gasps rose from the crowd. You're dissolving Pine Hollow? Someone cried. Yes, the judge said. It cannot stand. Not on this soil. Not under that roof. Pastor Phillips closed his eyes. Then we bury the dead, properly, and begin again elsewhere. The silence that followed was not despair. It was acceptance. But Rebecca wasn't done. There's something else. She said. The room froze again. Rachel's voice followed. The trail murders didn't stop in 1820. The implications settled like smoke. You're saying this continued? Judge Harrison asked. Not the same men, Rebecca clarified. But others learned. The methods, the silence, the burial places, the opportunity. Sheriff Mackenzie cursed under his breath. A tradition of murder. Judge Harrison turned to the sheriff. Then our investigation widens again. Find out how far the rot has spread. And though the townspeople had thought the worst was behind them, the twins had shown that rot, once rooted, doesn't die easily. It spreads, unless cut clean. That night, as the sun set over a town being slowly dismantled, piece by piece, truth by truth, Rebecca and Rachel stood near the broken church steps, their father's arms gently around their shoulders. "They quieter now?" Ezekiel asked softly. Rebecca nodded. "A little faith and hope are almost gone." Rachel's eyes glistened. "But others are waking up." Ezekiel closed his eyes. "Then we keep listening until they're heard." As the third day dawned over Pine Hollow, the air hung heavier than ever before. There was no wind, no birdsong, only silence, like the land itself was holding its breath. The church was a gutted shell now, its wooden floor pulled up, its sanctuary bare. But what it had lost in structure, it had gained in meaning. The very soil beneath it now told a story that could no longer be denied. And yet, the Morrison twins had made one thing clear. This was not the end. The rot had not stopped with the original founders. It had evolved, disguised itself in new faces, new methods. Murder had become memory, and memory had grown quiet, until now. Judge Harrison stood once again inside the church, now a makeshift courtroom that felt more like a confessional. The pews were gone, but the people remained, huddled in tense anticipation. On this morning, the past was no longer the only focus. Now the future, or what was left of it, demanded answers. Rebecca and Rachel sat together, hands folded, eyes forward. They looked less like children and more like witnesses. From another world, Judge Harrison began without ceremony. "Miss Rebecca," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you said the killings didn't end in 1820. Explain what you meant." Rebecca stood, her voice steady. The mine shaft was used again, not by the elders, by younger men who learned. From them, some were sons, others were just ... watching. Rachel added, "They saw what could be gotten away with. They used the same trail, the same silence." Pastor Phillips swallowed hard. "Are you saying there are more victims?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, we can name 3, maybe more. Where are they?" The sheriff asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Rachel turned her head toward the church wall. 2 are in the creek. 1 is under the schoolhouse. A collective gasp cut through the room like a knife. "The school?" Someone whispered. "The children's school?" Rebecca's face remained still. He was buried during the construction. No one asked questions when the ground was soft. Brennan stood now, his legal pad filled with more ink than white space. "We'll excavate immediately," he said. "If there are remains, ... We'll find them," Mackenzie finished. The town watched as shovels were brought out again. The investigation expanded, beyond the church, beyond the mine, into the very heart of the town, its school, its water, its memory. That afternoon, near the old schoolhouse, beneath the flagpole the children had once danced around during spring recitals, workers found the body. The skeleton was curled into the earth, arms still bound behind the back, with what remained of a leather strap. A crushed metal coin purse lay nearby, its contents long rotted. In the purse was a rusted name tag, C. Foster, a merchant known to have passed through the region around 1827. The discovery shattered the illusion that the sins of Pine Hollow were limited to a distant past. It revealed that even as the founding, elders faded into old age, the hunger that drove them had lived on in others. Sons, nephews, apprentices, no one had asked questions. And so the killing continued, quietly, efficiently. Rebecca and Rachel had been right again. By the time the second body was found, tangled in the roots, along Devil's Creek, people had stopped asking how the girls knew. They simply accepted that they did. That evening, Judge Harrison stood before the townspeople once more. "This is no longer a case of historical injustice," he said. "It is an ongoing criminal investigation. The blood on this town's hands doesn't belong solely to its founders. He gestured toward Sheriff Mackenzie. From this moment on, every man who worked on the schoolhouse project will be questioned. Every record of travelers passing through will be reviewed. No one is exempt. The sheriff nodded grimly. We'll re-examine every missing person report from the past 20 years. As people dispersed, shaken and wordless, Pastor Phillips turned to Ezekiel Morrison. How much more do they know? He asked. Ezekiel shook his head slowly. They don't know everything. Only what finds them. And what about after this? The pastor pressed. What happens to them? They keep walking, Ezekiel said quietly, from one town to another, carrying voices that no one else can hear. Pastor Phillips looked at the girls. They were seated on the church steps, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the western ridge. There was a serenity to them, but also a weariness that no child should ever have to wear. He walked over and sat beside them. Do the voices ever stop? He asked gently. Rebecca glanced toward her sister. Rachel gave a small nod, then said, They stop when people finally listen. Rebecca added, Some voices fade after they're remembered, but some, they're louder. They've been ignored too long. Are there more here? He asked. Rachel didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, There's one in the church wall. Phillips froze. What? Rebecca placed a hand on the stone near the altar. Behind here. Someone tried to hide her. The sheriff and Judge Harrison were summoned. With reluctant hands and anxious hearts, they began dismantling part of the wall behind the pulpit. An hour later, they uncovered a shallow cavity sealed with stone. Inside were the remains of a young girl, smaller than the others. A broken comb, torn lace, no identification, no record of her ever having existed. Rachel stepped forward. She didn't have a name, she said softly. Not one anyone remembers. But she died because she saw too much. She was 10. Judge Harrison turned away, his face taut with horror. Who would do this? Someone cried from the crowd, but no answer came. Some crimes have no logic, only legacy. That night, Pastor Phillips led a candlelight vigil, not for the living, but for the dead who had finally been found. They lit flames for the 12 travelers, for the 4 members of the Whitman family, for the girl in the wall, for the unnamed, and for those yet to be discovered. As the townspeople held their candles, Phillips raised his voice. We are not here to bury our shame, he said. We are here to unearth it, to name it, to learn from it. The truth may curse us, but lies destroy us. The crowd remained silent, but many cried. And as the final prayer echoed through the hollow, 2 small figures stood apart, hands linked, eyes toward the stars. The wind rose gently. Rebecca whispered, She's at peace now. Rachel nodded. She remembers who she is. And in that moment, for the first time since they had arrived, the twins smiled. 3 days had passed since the first body was exhumed from beneath Pine Hollow's church. 3 days of digging, weeping, and revelations that cracked the soul of the settlement wide open. What had begun as an investigation into forgotten crimes had grown into a reckoning that touched nearly every family in town. The dead were no longer memories. They were voices. They were evidence. And they were everywhere. By now, no one doubted Rebecca and Rachel Morrison. Their presence no longer stirred whispers, only a solemn, unspoken awe. The community no longer questioned how 2 9-year-old girls could know what no one had ever said aloud. They had seen too much, heard too much. They were truth given form, and truth, once heard, is never easily forgotten. The church had become a field office for justice. Judge Harrison presided over formal depositions. Sheriff Mackenzie compiled lists of suspected accomplices. Solicitor Brennan prepared restitution filings for the families of victims. And Pastor Phillips, who had once believed his greatest calling was delivering Sunday sermons, now found himself guiding a community through the slow, painful work of repentance. But the most haunting role still belonged to the twins. They led investigators to new places. The base of a dried-up well where someone's wedding ring was found wrapped in cloth. The hollow under a barn floor where a blood-stained ledger had been hidden. The edge of a ravine where Rachel quietly said, "He fell, but he was pushed." The dead, it seemed, were not yet done speaking, and neither were the twins Dot. It was on the morning of the fourth day that something changed. The air itself seemed to shift, colder, more brittle, the kind of air that made old wood creak and dogs refuse to bark. Rebecca stood at the edge of the graveyard behind the church, staring at the unmarked spot where the Whitman family had been buried. Rachel knelt nearby, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the dirt. Ezekiel Morrison stood at a distance, watching his daughters with a mixture of sorrow and vigilance. He'd seen the signs before, a kind of stillness that overtook them when something new, something terrible, was pressing to be known. "They're close," Rachel whispered. Rebecca nodded. "Not the Whitmans, others, ones we didn't expect." Pastor Phillips approached cautiously. "Who, child?" Rebecca's voice trembled. "The ones who watched and said nothing. The ones who let it happen because silence was safer." Rachel added, "The dead know who stayed quiet." That afternoon, Judge Harrison reconvened court. But this time, the accused weren't murderers. They were the complicit. People who hadn't killed with their hands, but with their silence. Those who had looked away, covered up, enabled. Samuel Turner was called first. His theft had already been exposed, but the twins revealed something more. He had known about the bodies in the mine, had been told by Elder Bradford years ago, but said nothing. He claimed he hadn't believed it. But the dreams had haunted him ever since. Then came Dr. Hayes, who admitted that while assisting with burials in his younger years, he had recognized signs of trauma on the corpses, fractures, broken ribs, evidence of struggle. But he'd told himself frontier deaths were messy, unpredictable, that it wasn't his place to question. One by one, the secrets spilled out. Crime had always been wider than the killers. It had relied on the silence of the town itself. And still, the girls weren't finished. That evening, as dusk fell, Rebecca turned to Judge Harrison and said, "There's one more." "Who?" he asked, though his chest already tightened. Rachel looked down at her feet. "Pastor Hayes." Phillips's eyes widened. But Hayes confessed in the journal. He recorded what happened. Rebecca's voice was barely audible. He didn't just record it. He helped plan it. The room erupted in gasps. Even Judge Harrison looked shaken. "He told the elders to do it quickly," Rachel added, "so the girls wouldn't suffer. He helped wrap the bodies, helped build the foundation over them. And then he wrote the journal hoping someone would find it one day." Philip stumbled back as if struck. "But he was the one who taught me everything I know about service." Ezekiel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Even the guilty can teach truth. Sometimes the words outlive the man." The twins remained calm, their faces composed. They weren't there to judge, only to reveal Dot, and as the final candle burned low, inside the now roofless church, Pastor Phillips stood before the remaining congregation. "I know many of you are afraid," he said, "afraid that your name will be the next one spoken. But the dead don't speak to punish. They speak to be remembered, to be acknowledged, and maybe to rest." Rebecca stood beside him now. "Justice doesn't always mean punishment," she said. "Sometimes it just means truth." Rachel nodded. "And truth sets everyone free, even the ones who died scared." The words fell into the silence like bells ringing in snow. Outside, the wind picked up again. It was colder than before, but cleaner, lighter. The townspeople dispersed quietly that night, returning to homes that no longer felt familiar. Everything they thought they knew about their town, their neighbors, their past, it had all changed. The following morning, 3 more townsfolk voluntarily approached Judge Harrison to confess knowledge of disappearances. One of them broke down while admitting to moving a body he didn't kill. Another had been paid to say nothing about a missing tradesman. The wave of silence had finally begun to break. But with each confession, the twins grew quieter. They no longer offered names unless asked. They stopped finishing each other's sentences. They spent more time watching the sky or walking among the gravestones. It was Phillips who noticed it first. They looked tired. That night, he found, and sitting alone behind the church, watching fireflies rise over the cemetery. "Are they gone?" he asked. Rebecca smiled faintly. "Some are. Faith and Hope, Marcus Webb, the man in the ravine. They don't whisper anymore." Rachel leaned her head on her sister's shoulder. "But some still wait. For what?" Phillips asked. Rebecca's answer was soft, but firm. For someone to believe them. By the 5th day, Pine Hollow no longer resembled a town. It resembled an open wound. Streets once used for Sunday strolls now bore the tracks of wagons, carrying bones, journals, and confiscated property. The courthouse floor, formerly the church's sanctuary, was stained with the dust of unearthed truths. The wind carried fewer hymns now, and more questions. The Morrison twins remained at the center of it all, as they had from the beginning. But something about them was changing. Rebecca's once steady voice wavered more often. Rachel, who had seemed so composed, began pausing mid-sentence, her eyes drifting toward things no one else could see. "They're getting tired," Ezekiel told Pastor Phillips one morning as the 2 men stood beneath the bare rafters of the dismantled chapel. "Of speaking?" Phillips asked. "Of carrying," Ezekiel said. "Every name, every image. They carry it like a weight. You'd be tired too if you walked around holding a dozen ghosts." Phillips nodded. He had seen it in their eyes. The same light that once illuminated their insight now flickered like a candle nearing its wick. And still, there was more to uncover. The mine shaft had revealed a 4th body overnight. This time, the victim was a woman, not a traveler, but a Pine Hollow resident who had vanished in 1824. Her name was Eliza Parrish, a midwife known for keeping detailed ledgers. She had disappeared after voicing concerns about young girls. In town, turning up bruised and silent. They said she ran off with a drifter, someone muttered. But the truth lay buried under 3 feet of earth and silence. A ledger, recovered beside her remains, listed names. Not of victims, but of men. Men who had paid her to remain quiet. It was the final crack in the dam. Judge Harrison, grim-faced and furious, summoned a full assembly that morning. This time, the gathering was not just to hear confessions or pass judgment. It was to decide the fate of Pine Hollow itself. "I've spent 30 years upholding the law," he said, standing tall before the town's trembling faces. "But I've never seen a place so completely corroded from within." He gestured toward the desecrated church behind him. "What you built here, the homes, the families, the faith, you built it on stolen lives and broken souls. No law can cleanse that. Only truth can." The townsfolk murmured, some defiant, some ashamed. Many wept openly. "I hereby declare Pine Hollow defunct as a civic entity," Harrison continued. "Its lands will be sold, its records archived, its name stricken from the territorial registry." Shock rippled outward. "You can't erase us," someone cried. "I'm not erasing," Harrison replied. "I'm acknowledging what you refused." 2. A town that hides its crimes in the walls of a church is not a town at all. It's a lie dressed in Scripture. The sheriff looked down. Even Brennan, hardened by years of courtroom combat, couldn't hide the tremble in his hands. The twins? They simply stood still, quiet like echoes waiting to fade. At afternoon, Pastor Phillips delivered what would be Pine Hollow's final sermon. There was no pulpit, no hymn books, just the broken beams of the former church and the mournful faces of those left to mourn their illusion of innocence. "We are taught that confession leads to grace," he said. "But confession without change is only theater. We've confessed, yes, but now we must atone." He paused. "You will not all go to prison, but you will all carry this. Some will rebuild elsewhere. Others will never outrun what happened here. But wherever you go, let it not be in silence." As the people dispersed, many for the last time, Rachel tugged gently on Phillips's sleeve. "There's still one more," she said. He turned, alarmed. "One more body?" "No," Rebecca replied softly. "One more secret." She led him back inside the church, or what was left of it. At the base of the pulpit, hidden beneath a loose slab of foundation, they pulled out a small rusted tin. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed with time. Phillips read aloud, "To whomever finds this, if you are reading these words, then what we buried has risen. I was weak. I feared man more than I feared God, but I will not take it with me into death. My name is Pastor Morai Hayes, and I was the one who lit the fire." The blood drained from Phillips's face. He didn't just help. He started it, Rebecca nodded. He made the others promise they'd stay silent. He said the fire would cleanse it all. Rachel added, "But it didn't. It just burned the truth deeper." Ezekiel stepped forward, his eyes heavy with the weight of another revelation. Even the shepherd lost his way. Phillips said nothing, only lowered his head. Later that evening, Phillips personally lit the final candle in the chapel ruins. It wasn't for worship. It was for remembrance. For Faith and Hope Whitman. For Jacob and Mary. For the unborn twins. For Marcus Webb and all the other names that had finally found their way into the light. The flame flickered wildly in the mountain wind. But it did not go out, And then, just before dusk, Rachel turned to her sister and whispered something. Rebecca looked to Ezekiel and to Phillips. "It's time," she said. "For what?" the pastor asked. "To go," Rachel replied. "They're quiet now." Phillips felt something loosen in his chest. Relief and sorrow, tangled like roots. "You'll leave Pine Hollow?" Ezekiel nodded. "The dead here have spoken. It's time. To go where the silence is still hiding." Phillips looked at the girls, so small, and yet so immeasurably heavy with the burden of truth. "Do you know where you'll go?" he asked. Rebecca looked to the horizon. "Someplace where the dreams still tremble." Rachel finished for her, "Where the walls still listen." The sun rose over Pine Hollow for the last time, like a reluctant witness to history. Its light, usually filtered through the misty veil of the eastern hills, now spilled fully and unapologetically across the land. For once there was no fog, no gray curtain shielding the town from what had finally been seen. The church was silent, now nothing more than bones, roofless, floorless, a skeleton of sanctity, stripped down to its shame. The homes were half empty, the roads half traveled. Families packed wagons, some tearfully, some quietly. Others remained behind, rooted by shame, pride, or penance. The name Pine Hollow would soon vanish from maps, but it would never disappear from memory. In the midst of the fading town stood Ezekiel Morrison and his daughters, their bags light, their eyes heavier than ever. Rebecca clutched her father's hand. Rachel held her worn notebook, the one she filled with drawings of people she'd never met, but somehow always knew. "Are you ready?" Ezekiel asked gently, his voice more breath than sound. The girls nodded. They had done what they came. To do that, Pastor Phillips approached one last time. He looked older than he had just a week ago, as though the weight of history had pressed him down into the earth with the dead. "You're really leaving," he said, though he already knew the answer. Rebecca looked up at him. "This place is quiet now," Rachel added, "but others aren't." Phillips didn't ask where they were going. He knew they would follow the silence and wait for it to crack. "I wish I had something to give you," he said. "You gave." "You something," Rebecca replied. "You listened." They embraced, not as strangers, not as preacher and prophet, but as people who had survived something terrible and sacred together. Ezekiel shook Phillips's hand. "There will be towns like this," he said, "and there will be people like you in them. That's how things change." With no fanfare, no farewell crowd, the Morrison family walked to the edge of the hollow. Behind them, the ruins of Pine Hollow stood as testimony, not tragedy. As they reached the trailhead, Rachel stopped and looked back. "They're not all resting," she said softly. "Some don't want to rest," Rebecca agreed. "They want to be remembered." And with that, they vanished into the trees. The town was officially disbanded a week later, its records boxed and sent to the Territorial Archives in Lexington, its name removed from church rosters and civic directories. What remained was purchased. In pieces, land, parceled off to distant buyers who'd never know the names that whispered through its soil. Judge Harrison returned to the city, where he submitted a full report, then took an uncharacteristically long leave of absence. Some said he retired early. Others said he stopped sleeping. Sheriff Mackenzie stayed for a time, overseeing the relocation of families, the repatriation of victims' remains, and the final confessions that trickled in like late snow. He never carried a badge again. Solicitor. Brennan continued his work, filing restitution claims, arguing for reparations in courtrooms up and down the territory. But he, too, avoided speaking publicly about Pine Hollow. Pastor Phillips stayed behind the longest, long enough to preside over reburials, to plant new crosses where names had once been erased, and to build a small wooden bench where the altar used to be. He came there daily, not to preach, but to remember. He wrote a new sermon, one never delivered aloud, titled "When the Church Forgot to Listen." He left it beneath the bench before he, too, walked away. Years passed, then decades. The story of Pine Hollow passed into rumor, then folklore. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it had never existed at all. A few brave hikers found the broken foundations, the overgrown graves, the stone cross half swallowed by moss. None stayed long. But sometimes, just sometimes, people passing through the region would report strange things. A dream about a girl with a wooden doll. A whisper in the wind calling a forgotten name. A voice in a child's mouth. Too wise for its years, they would wake unsettled. Moved, changed. And always, somewhere in the distance, a quiet road would lead away from the woods. A road few noticed, unless they were meant to. Those who followed it sometimes spoke of a man and two daughters traveling on foot, always arriving where they were needed, never staying long. They came when the air grew heavy, when churches stopped listening, when silence grew too loud to ignore, and when they left, the dead finally rested.